This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
And I'm Mel. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are so pleased to have on our podcast today horror author Cynthia Pelayo.
Cynthia Pelayo is the Bram Stoker award-winning author of Forgotten Sisters, Children of Chicago, and The Shoemaker's Magician. In addition to writing genre-blending novels that incorporate fairy tale, mystery, detective, crime, and horror elements, Pelayo has written numerous short stories, including the collection Lotteria and the poetry collection Crime Scene. The recipient of the 2021 International Latino Book Award, she holds a Master of Fine Arts in Writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She lives in Chicago with her family. For more information, visit www.cinapalayo.com.
Vanishing Daughters is a breathtaking novel of psychological suspense about a haunted woman who is stalked by a serial killer and confronts the horrors of fairy tales and the nightmares of real life. It started the night journalist Briar Thorne's mother died in their rambling old mansion on Chicago's South Side. The nightmares of a woman in white pleading to come home, music switched on in locked rooms, and the panicked fear of being swallowed by the dark. Bree has almost convinced herself that these stirrings of dread are simply manifestations of grief and not the beyond world of ghostly impossibilities her mother believed in. And more tangible terrors still lurk outside the decaying Victorian greystone. A serial killer has claimed the lives of 51 women in the Chicago area. When Bree starts researching the murders, she meets a stranger who tells her there's more to her sleepless nights and bad dreams. They hold the key to putting ghosts to rest and stopping a killer. But the killer has caught on and is closing in. And if Bree doesn't answer the call of the dead soon, she'll be walking among them. Listeners, as I'm sure you noticed from our introductory material before this particular interview, Matt and I are talking to author Cynthia Pelayo tonight about her latest book, Vanishing Daughters. Welcome to the podcast, Cynthia.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for talking to us. All right, I am going to kick us off with our first question for you. So, I have read Forgotten Sisters in addition to this one. In fact, Lisa and I talked to you about Forgotten Sisters on the Monster She Wrote podcast. So, listeners, if you want to go back and check that out, you can. And one thing that I noticed reading both of these is that, and I believe this also holds for your other work as well, because I remember us talking a little bit about this on the Monster She Wrote podcast. Chicago is a very important setting for you. In fact, you could almost say as a character in your work, and particularly in this one as well. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the research you did into the history of the city for this particular book. Was this a different angle that you took maybe than other work that you've done on Chicago?
So, this one, I took a lot of geographic liberties in some of the descriptions. So, it does take place on the south side of Chicago, which is an area that I haven't explored too much in my writing, and other parts that extend beyond Chicago that are Chicagoans are very familiar with, like Justice, Illinois, that where much of the folklore takes place in. So it was a different approach, and I had to stretch some things in terms of location, but it was a new area and that I was happy to discuss and write about.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and preface this to listeners if you hadn't noticed, where Lisa was unable to make it for this. She sends her regrets. She's under the weather. So I'm going to ask this question that I know 100% this was Lisa's question, but I'm going to ask it for her. So the Victorian home is plays a pretty big part in this novel, and Lisa noted in her question that it has shades of the Gothic. But what was it that made you want to include this element in this novel?
So there are a number of houses that are we associate with being a part of just Chicago's architectural history. There's like the bungalow, there's the craftsmen, and then the brownstones and the greystones. And many of these homes are, uh, many of them are located along certain boulevards. They Many of them were also built by early European immigrants to the Chicagoland area. And in recent years, um, I mean, gentrification has really taken off in many communities. And another victim of gentrification has been these homes where many of them have been gutted completely and they've just lost all of their historical character. The only thing that like really remains of historical significance is just the outside. And so I wanted to explore the brownstone or the greystone, especially in the south side of Chicago. There are these gorgeous mansions that were built there. Many of them that haven't been rehabbed. Some of them are just not in excellent condition. They're just like falling apart. And so I've just spent hours and hours on real estate websites, just like looking through these homes and just seeing, many of them still have like the original woodworking, but, there might be floors that are completely gone in some instances. And I started thinking about the families that built these, that they came to the United States as immigrants and they established they established many iconic businesses, one of which is the Zenith Radio Company, which I talk about in the book. And I thought about, well, that's a great example of a type of business that really isn't popular today, owning a radio. Those aren't making any money. So what would happen to someone if that's what their ancestral home was? Like their ancestors came and they had this booming business. They built this gorgeous home, but over time, the business just kind of, fades and the home fades with it. And so that is where the mansion comes in. And that was like my thought process with building it. And I really wanted it to feel like this decayed decadence where the outside is sort of creeping inside. It has like this fantastical garden outside, but it's just falling apart, this gorgeous home. And so little by little leaves just kind of get blown in and rose vines get like twisted in corners and just kind of stay there tucked in windows.
Yeah, I just kind of want to follow up on that because one of the things I thought was interesting about this house is, I mean, I think I mentioned this when we talked about Forgotten Sisters, is how much I love the supernatural and kind of ghostly things. And I thought this house was really interesting in what you were doing with it, not just with like supernatural kind of bump in the night stuff or playing with the radios, but also like the gothic elements of the portraits, but time, like you were saying, there's time and that it's kind of falling apart and the elements are coming in. But I also thought it was interesting that the family's history was kind of tied up in the house as well. And I was wondering if you looked at this space also as like a haunted space or a in between or liminal type space.
I definitely think of the home as a liminal space in this novel. Like it just is so fascinating to me how a house can exist within a family over time. And what does, and like even in Forgotten Sisters, I thought about, energy, energetically. There are people that are born that were, even today, people are born in homes, people die in houses. And so I'm not saying I believe in ghosts. I'm not saying I am completely into the belief of the supernatural quite yet, but I do believe in energy, and I do believe that houses sort of store energy. And yeah, I think many of us have been to places where we just instinctively say, "Wow, this place has great energy," or "I feel really wonderful here." And we equally have been to places where we feel at ease in certain areas. And I feel like that's so for homes over time, especially a house that has known a lot of love and laughter, and or maybe a house that hasn't had so much kindness within its walls. I feel like there's something energetically that's trapped within that space and um can be felt throughout time.
That's so fascinating because I think people who know me know that I'm pretty skeptical about ghosts. That doesn't, I don't completely I guess, discount them per se, but it would take a whole lot for me to believe them. But I do definitely see what you're saying about, I mean, it almost seems like metaphorical. I do think there's a feeling we get from homes, and that history and time and our memories can be a type of haunting, even if we're not saying they're an actual spirit or ghost.
Oh, totally. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to. Of course, this is a ghost story, so ghosts do appear, but I feel like that's almost what I believe in a sense. I mean, I've had very curious experiences recently that are difficult for me to um, uh, just kind of discount them entirely. But for ages, I've always have been a skeptic, and it would take a lot for me to believe. And I personally went like on this whole paranormal journey many years ago where I went to Gettysburg and I went to the Edinburgh Vaults. I went to all these, places that are reportedly like really haunted and people have experienced things there. And I didn't really experience anything completely profound, but I've had a few experiences that I feel like are curious, or even being at like I mentioned Gettysburg, even being there, there's like this sadness that just kind of hangs in the air. Or even going into, my father died in his house and he had home hospice. And even that memory of him in that room, it still lingers there for us who remember him. So there's still something there. And maybe that's a ghost, just the memory of that event, the memory of those people that we um, associate with that space.
Yeah, there's something almost sacred about it.
Yeah, I think so. I am yeah, I like to in my writing. I feel like my writing l- aims, in addition to exploring various themes of cycles of violence. I think a lot of my writing is based in remembrance and um, not forgetting those who have died. I know some people have said, "Well, why is it important to remember people who have died?" And I just can't even think of even asking that question, because to me, I feel like if somebody lived um, a good life, it would be it is valuable in a way to kind of honor them and honor their memory.
I completely agree with you there. I feel like our legacy, our memories that we leave for other people is, I mean, that is our legacy more than anything else. So I love that idea that that could be the quote unquote ghost is the memory of someone. So ghosts aren't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah. I especially with the missing or unsolved cases of murdered women that I cover in this novel. And I've covered in my other writing as well. I do cover a lot of like missing people, murdered people, and I it's just such a fascinating phenomenon. Just this idea of like numerous unsolved cases, and these were people that lived and breathed and that existed and had families, and then it's just so strange to me to not give space or thought to them. And so I do feel like I can do something small in my writing to kind of give them some sort of recognition.
Were any of the missing women that appeared in the novel, were they based on real people, or was it kind of an amalgamation?
Um, so the number 51 is the number of unsolved murdered women on the south side of Chicago. So there have been about 51 women who have been murdered in very similar circumstances. Um, Many of them women of color, um, across a 20-year period. Many of them were found strangled, were found burned, completely set on fire, were found in dumpsters or garbage cans. So, very similar circumstances. And authorities have said that there are no connections between their cases, and community members have held protests. They've had discussions with law enforcement. Law enforcement have had meetings to say that they do not believe that a serial killer is at work. We disagree because, and even the Murder Accountability Project that I cite in the book, which is a real organization that kind of plots these unsolved murders in like a geographic area, and it feeds it into an algorithm, and it pinpoints that space, that area in the south side of Chicago, as being one of the highest uh, potentiality in the United States of having an operating serial killer. And so there is something that um, many of us find should be further investigated. So there was the 51, and then there was, I mentioned briefly, one of the women who was found murdered in a forested area, and that is a true case. And that was just recently solved. Her killer was just caught, so I'm happy about that.
Well, how did you weave together the true crime elements into the central mystery along with the ghosts? I know you may have kind of answered that question already, but I'm curious if you have more to add about the true crime alongside the supernatural.
Um, so that's always an interesting balancing act in my writing, where I do weave in multiple themes. And I think over time, I've gotten better in my writing, where I have learned to space things out a little bit more, because my writing will generally have Chicago as a character, although I am pivoting into other geographic spaces with my upcoming work. But generally, Chicago, I know, is going to be a character, and then I know I'm going to have a fairy tale at play. I will have a crime or detective or mystery element, and then maybe like the overall theme. Um, and like maybe like I guess a good example, like we can look at Children of Chicago, for example. We had it was a detective story, it had Chicago history, we had the Pied Piper, and the overarching theme I felt, or I was aiming for, was how sometimes people that we think are meant to protect us, in this case law enforcement with Children of Chicago, aren't there to protect us, and they can be the villain. And so my writing, another tangent, is theme based. I don't think my writing so much is character based. And so from there, I develop a very detailed outline. So, and then my outline now, I think it's much better, um, where I do plot out chapter per chapter how those various themes are falling out. So I try to make sure they're spaced out a little bit better. So for example, I make sure that if I'm if it's a certain fairy tale that I'm covering, like Sleeping Beauty with Vanishing Daughters, I want to make sure that that fairy tale is present in every single chapter somehow, and that can be not necessarily saying the name Sleeping Beauty, but maybe talking about some imagery that might be associated with Sleeping Beauty, like dreams or flowers, sleeping women. And then with Chicago, I make sure that there's some type of Chicago element that exists in all of the chapters, with a place, some type of historical event, and so on. So I make sure by chapter, there's a balance, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And actually that was one of the things that we wanted to talk with you about this time, is the fact that you do this kind of genre combination, which I love. I think it one of the things I enjoy about your work is the mix of like the detective story and the fairy tale and the supernatural and the way you put the history in. Um and I was just wondering, like, do you see, since so you were talking about how a lot of your work does this, are you seeing these novels as not just connecting thematically, but like they're in their kind of, how can I put this? Like they're in similar worlds. Like they're in a world where these supernatural things and these aspects of fairy tales popping into real life or shifting of time is possible. Like, do you almost see all your characters kind of populating one fictional area?
Yes. So they all do. There is in my brain, it's my universe. So they all exist in a variation and a different possibility that where these things exist. So all of my novels all take place in the same universe, and they're some small hints, super small hints, because I have to be careful because they're with different publishers in some instances, but they're super tall, super small little like Easter eggs. And all of, maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't get in trouble, but they're super small Easter eggs in all of them that will connect all of them. So they are all in the same universe.
I thought I noticed a couple, so I'm glad I'm not crazy. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Oh my
oh, go
gosh.
ahead.
Yeah, someone was like, she mentioned the same commander and
Hmm.
this from like her first book. I'm like, yes. So I have to be super careful because since they are with now different publishers, like they're across different publishers. And so it's like, oh, I always have to be super, super careful with all of that. Like, how can I make sure they're tied somehow and I don't get in trouble?
Oh man, yeah, that's that's an interesting problem to have.
Yeah.
But well,
Yeah.
I kind of want to push off on that with and obviously we don't, we know people are going to want to read Vanishing Daughters, so you don't want to spoil something, do not spoil it. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, because you mentioned it's a Sleeping Beauty fairy tale this time in this book, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe why you chose that fairy tale or why you wanted to make it central to this one.
I thought this one fit pretty well with what I wanted to explore. And went back and I read there's multiple variations of Sleeping Beauty, like tons and tons of variations. And I went back and I read all of them that I could find and that were translated. And what I found interesting is in one of the earliest variations of Sleeping Beauty. So we always assume, or we always reference the many of us will reference like the Walt Disney version in which the prince kisses her and she wakes up. In the version that I love, Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, she wakes up on her own. So it's not a prince that saves her, which I remember reading that and just kind of sitting back and gasping like she saved herself. She was cursed, although she was cursed for 100 years. And I found it very sad because here she is, a beautiful baby, brand new baby, and she was cursed by a woman who was bitter and angry and jealous. And because of that, she curses a newborn infant for 100 years. And it was no fault of her own. She didn't do anything. She just existed. And I thought that was so sad. She was cursed to sleep for 100 years just because, well, if when she would prick her finger on a spinning spindle, just because she existed. And when she wakes at that 100-year mark, of course, everyone that knew her or she knew, because she pricked her finger when she was a teen, was dead. So it was almost like she was dead. And so it's still sad because she's lost everybody. She still she was hated so much just for existing, but ultimately she saved herself. She just woke up. She didn't need a man to save her.
I really wish I had read that version. I don't think I did. I guess I'm more familiar with Sleeping Beauty through Disney, unfortunately. Those
Mm.
early versions of the fairy tales are so much darker
Yeah,
than I think what we're used to.
yeah, yeah, definitely the Grimm's variation, the Grimm's fairy tales are very dark, some of them, and just brutal. And they're all warnings, or many of them are warnings that I feel like are very applicable today. And that's why we just keep going back to them. Something as simple as, Little Red Riding Hood. What's the warning? Be careful. you know, on a walk. And so many women to this day, like, we are fearful, even walking to our cars after the grocery store, in a grocery store parking lot, because awful things happen. And this is a story that was written hundreds of years ago, Little Red Riding Hood. And it's just so applicable today, that warning to women to be cautious about your surroundings.
Well, excuse me, sorry. Pivoting a little bit to another theme that is pretty central to the book, you definitely explore grief quite a lot in the book. Why do you think it was important to explore such a heavy subject matter?
Um, a few reasons. Well, first I was grieving. Um, and then I was grieving the death of my dad, and I was experiencing a lot of these strange physical, emotional, and spiritual disruptions that Bree was experiencing, and I was super confused. Like, I had no idea that grief could manifest itself physically in the body, for example. And I remember going to my doctor and just like listing out this strange set of things I was experiencing. And he was just like, "That's grief, Cynthia." And I was like, "Really?" So, my shoulder, for example, I developed something called frozen shoulder, where my right shoulder became locked and I couldn't move it. I couldn't raise it above my head. And it happened right after the funeral. I was like, "What is going on?" He's like, "This is your brain. Your brain is attacking your body." And I was like, "I didn't know that could happen." And then I told him, I'm waking up in the middle of the night screaming, and I'm having these strange auditory hallucinations and these strange, like, I wake up in the middle of the night and I think I see something. He's like, "No, this you are unfortunately where you need to be, and you just have to go through this." It was a very I think a lot of people, I tell them, well, my dad died, and and they don't understand why I have the trauma that I do, and it's because I was caring for somebody at home hospice, so I was watching him wither away, and there's a lot of very traumatic things with watching somebody you love physically waste away from like a 250-pound person to like 80 pounds. There's a lot of biologically just shocking things that happen. Um, and That was traumatic to see and experience. And so some of those things did make it into the book. Even something as strange as sitting at the funeral home and having the mortician tell me, "Don't forget to bring your father's teeth." uh and I just remember going home and standing in his medicine cabinet and holding his teeth like we're in a container, and just it's just a strange moment. And I remember thinking to myself, this is such a bizarre thing, to take my dad's teeth to somebody to put them in his mouth, and prepare him for burial. So I wanted to really cover that and tell people that, especially people that understand what it's like. It's like, and I spoke with somebody else, and they call it like the fog of grief. You don't know where you're at in space and time. It's so confusing. Day becomes night, night becomes day, and you're not just grieving them. If it was a traumatic death, you're not just, processing that, but you're also grieving who you were with that person. That was something that was very hard for me, because the who I was when I was just sitting with my dad, reading a newspaper in the backyard, drinking a cup of coffee, doesn't exist anymore. That person died with him. Our inside jokes, that died with him. And so that was why it was important for me to cover grief the way that I did.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm so sorry for your loss. And that was one of the really realistic parts of the book for me, that not just the character experiencing those things, but also the fact that the character was interested in um, like kind of researching those things, right? Like trying to understand the process, which really puts you there with them as the reader, I think.
Yes. And, I think many of us o- collectively experienced grief after COVID, but we were all rushed back to normalcy so
Yes.
quickly that
Hmm.
we were not allowed to have that space and time. And so those, I feel like so much has manifested in other places because we didn't have that time as a collective to really sit back and say, oh my gosh, how many millions of people died? Like we were wiping our groceries with like alcohol wipes and we were hugging our family members from like afar and it was just this massive global phenomenon. And like we all saw the refrigerated trucks outside of hospitals and it was just like okay, within a matter of space and time it was just like this light switch, like okay, everybody go back, everyone's back in the office now, and keep working and being productive. And where was the collective conversation about what we had all experienced? There wasn't one, and that's trauma, and that is living with us. That's part of our identity now because we haven't really processed it.
Oh, I completely agree. I was actually talking about the similar thing with a colleague of mine from work a few weeks ago. We were just talking about how teaching changed so fast during COVID, and now we've just kind of gone back. And there's stuff that we do now that we do because of that. But like you're right, there's almost like a group repression of it. Like it's over now. We're just going to move on and try to get back to normal. But it's hard to even know, like we're never going to be back to normal. It's always going to be something that we hold within us, whether we want to look at it and work through it, or we just, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues we're creating in our society by turning a blind eye to it and not working through it.
Yeah, and I think, I think there's a number of things that I've seen manifest that I just, it's hard to say, of course, like is this because of COVID? Is this because of something else? But, there's just a number of, you know, people experiencing or diagnosed with depression, people diagnosed with anxiety disorders. I just personally feel like I've seen these skyrocket. And I'm not saying it's necessarily tied to COVID, but I feel like a lot of people haven't had the adequate compassion and care that we should be providing as a within communities. um yeah, I think there's a lot. I definitely think there's a lot that can be explored regarding that time period and just like how we communicate with one another as well, because so much communication then went online and it was very distant and cold, and people forget even now that there's another person on the other side of that screen that has a life and that has things that are happening to them, and but people just so flippantly will say things um that I think has also contributed to a number of issues that people experience.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Matt, I don't want to step over you here if you want to jump in or have another question.
Well, I only had one other question personally, and this is a little bit of a pivot from what we were just talking about, but I was curious, without giving too much away, there are several chapters in the book that are from the killer's point of view. And I was wondering if that was something that was hard for you to kind of embody that side of things, because it really did feel like a distinctive voice, very separate from Bree's voice and character, and so it felt like he was his own person, and just wondering if that was difficult or something that you struggled with when writing.
Oh, it was so difficult. I hated being in Maul's head. It was like it was sick. Like I felt like when I would jump into Maul writing him, I wanted to get out of him as soon as possible. I just wanted to get in him, get whatever needed to be written, and get out because being in that mind was not good for me. I had gone back and read a number of serial killer novels because I wanted to explore, well, what makes just let's look at the I wanted to go back and look at some iconic serial killers. So I went back and I read Psycho and I read um Silence of the Lambs, and I did looked at Dexter. And somebody recommended that I read Joyce Carol Oates's Zombie, and I couldn't even finish it. I got about halfway and I had to get the book out of my house because I was so upset. And Joyce Carol Oates' Zombie, if you're not familiar with that, I believe it did it win a Stoker? I can't remember. But it is like a fictionalized version of Jeffrey Dahmer told from that that killer's perspective. And it was so unsettling. And after reading that character, my serial killer popped into my head. And I was like, okay, I got it. I know who this person is now. I know how cold and disconnected they are. And I was able to write it because I needed to tap into that mindset that just looks at people who aren't even people. They're just things, and there is no anything else beyond it. So yes, very uncomfortable to write.
Well, I don't think either of us would think that's a bad thing that you had trouble embodying that. Mel, did you have any last questions or thoughts?
Well, I want to say I have not read that Joyce Carol Oates story you mentioned, but I've heard about it, and I probably should not read it because it sounds like it would be extremely disturbing. Um, then,
Like I don't, it's there's horror is a spectrum, right? There's like
mhm.
everything from quiet to extreme, and I gladly say I am on the quiet side, and that's like where I feel very comfortable. I love things that are atmospheric and thought provoking and very like psychological, but when it gets into very visceral, um I just can't go there. I feel uncomfortable, and I am happy that that exists because that's it serves its place, but it's just not something that I'm comfortable reading.
We're kind of in the same wheelhouse there. Like Matt and Lisa know that I kind of have a limit, and I'm cool with that being out there because if that's what someone wants to read and write, that's awesome. But yeah, I know what I'm into and
Yeah,
kind of where I want to stay.
exactly. Like I will completely own that I like, the glitter and gore that's not super gory. I just want
Hmm.
light and atmospheric. When it gets a little too angry and graphic, that I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, but that's yeah, and that's so if you explore Joyce Carol as a zombie, I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know.
I'll let you know if I work up the courage. All right. Well, I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap up our discussion of Vanishing Daughters. Cynthia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us. I just want to thank you again for coming on Monster She Wrote too. It's been wonderful to talk to you about both Forgotten Sisters and now Vanishing Daughters.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great speaking with you both. It's always a joy. Thank you.
Thank you. We are at No Fearcast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com, or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.